Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Bob Unger Show. We're very lucky today to have a fascinating guest who, as I told her, my younger son knew about her right away. And her name is Jennifer Say. And she was on a fast track working for Levi Strauss, the jeans people. And I don't mean Genes, Jeans. And then she began to stand up for what she believed. And it was apparently not in vogue with the woke crowd that has certain parameters that you're not allowed to go beyond. And so she ran into problems in her career track. So give us a little background and then we'll get into the heart of it.
Yeah, the shortish version is I ultimately spent close to 23 years at Levi's. So I started out as an entry level marketing assistant in 1999. Not sure how much of a fast track I was on, but I was on a slow track to the top. Um, in 2013, I became the chief marketing officer. I occupied that role for 8 years. I was a well liked, beloved employee, and I was told that I was in consideration for the CEO job. I ultimately got promoted again in 2020 to brand president, but at that point, I had already become quite outspoken about public school closures in my city, San Francisco, where I used to live, and nationally. I started immediately in March 2020. Didn't smell right to me from the very beginning. Um, and I was warned repeatedly over the course of 2 years that I needed to stop talking about this on social media, on local news, on national news. I wrote op eds, I led rallies. And the people who were telling me I needed to stop talking about it had their children in person private school. I couldn't bear the hypocrisy of that, so I continued. And ultimately, in January 2022, I was told there was no longer a place for me at the company. And rather than accept their severance, which would come with a non disclosure agreement, I didn't want the hush money. I quit very publicly and continue to speak out about the harms done to children during the pandemic, but also the censorship and viewpoint discrimination happening in corporate America.
Was this orally or was it in writing? In what way did they communicate this?
That there wasn't a place for me in the
Yeah,
company.
and that you shouldn't be engaging in these activities.
Well, I have lots of written communication not to engage in the activities, and those are all in my book, and I share lots of those on my own Substack. Some of them are pretty shocking. Um, at one point in 2021, I was told I needed to do an apology tour for my views, and I was told I needed to convey to people whether I was with them or against them. Are you with us or against us? Was the sort of premise of this tour. Are you good or bad? It was very binary. Are you a racist? As if anyone says yes. Does anyone say yes to that question? Are you a conspiracy theorist? All these insane questions. So those things are all in writing. There's no longer a place for you at the company was never put in writing. I was never handed the severance, even though I asked 3 times, but I was told that there was $1 million in severance for me if I would, pipe down a little longer. I did, I hadn't been quiet for 2 years at that point, so I wasn't about to start. As I was speaking out about the harms of school closures and all the restrictions to children, I just became increasingly alarmed at the hypocrisy of these woke, for lack of a better word, corporate leaders who pretend to care about social justice, but basically only care about lining their own pockets and doing what they want to do. And of course, the censorship, and now what appears to be private companies and the government, as well as the press, working in lockstep to silence people and to demonize dissenters in order to keep others quiet.
Well, what's interesting about that is invariably the sheep out there. Anytime I bring up big tech, and their fascist activities and suppressing speech, they'll say to me, "Oh, those are private companies." Well,
I know.
of course, the answer is I wish they were private companies, but as
Yeah.
from the Twitter release, they are in bed with the government. That's not a private company.
Yeah, when the government is exerting influence, coercion, etc., to censor people through private companies, that's clearly a free speech violation. But I would argue that when they work in lockstep without even having to be asked, that's when the um, that's when the sort of cycle is complete in a sense, when the private companies don't even need to be asked by the government. They just do their bidding to secure whatever favor they might secure, when the press does the same, when there's no daylight between government, private companies, and the press in terms of supporting the propaganda from the government. Um, this is when the authoritarian regime is complete. You know, I don't know. Do I think that the government was asking Levi's to tell me to be quiet? Not really, although there is a relationship between the governor of California and Levi's, personal family relationship. I was actually asked not to post anything about the recall election in the fall of 21, which is clear viewpoint discrimination. But I don't think it matters if they asked directly or not. They were carrying water for each other in carrying out these absurdly harmful, catastrophic policies.
It's kind of like the mafia movie when the Don looks at one of his henchmen as somebody he wants killed, walks out of the room, and he gives him just a look. And
Yeah, nothing has to be said anymore. It's sort of like yeah, the whatever they're doing together, the working in lockstep and carrying water for each other. And we saw it in the case of FTX. Now, Sam Bankman-Fried did just get arrested yesterday, but for a very long time, he adopted these woke poses, gave lots of money to the Democratic Party, was treated with tremendous fanfare by the press, all these fawning puff pieces. No one interrogated his actions and his behaviors. He said out loud, we Westerners adopt these woke poses so people like us. He knew what he was doing, and it worked for a time until it didn't. We'll see what happens now.
Yeah, it's amazing the lack of integrity in people in general. It goes just as far with Republicans as Democrats.
Oh yeah.
You would think that if you had someone who you had supported who was kicking back taxpayer dollars from Ukraine back to the Democratic Party, as we now find out they were doing, I would object to that strenuously. I wouldn't care which party is getting the kickback. They have
Right.
right to embezzle, in effect, taxpayer dollars. And yet, you'll find that if it is a Trump doing it, Republicans will make all kinds of excuses.
Yeah.
And if it's a Democrat or a Biden or one of these characters doing it, the other side will make excuses, whereas I apply the same standard, and I'm sure you do, to everyone.
Yeah, I'm not about to run from one team to the other. I think both teams are pretty rotten.
Mm-hmm.
If you veer, one step outside of their orthodoxy, challenge, question, you are demonized, vilified as everything that is evil. And, we're seeing it now play out with the Twitter files, where in many regards, what's being published is what many of us knew already about party influence in terms of, blacklisting, silencing, banning in some instances. My own husband is still banned from Twitter for challenging vaccines and lockdowns. 11,000 people have been banned from Twitter. Some of the most high profile ones have been let back on as of last night, but everyday citizens were banned from the platform for challenging these horrible policies and the effectiveness of the vaccines. Um,
And so you wrote a book. You wrote a book called it sounds funny, how do you pronounce it? Levi's or Levi?
Levi's Unbuttoned.
Levi's Unbuttoned. Double entendre, maybe. When it comes to these politicians, maybe it's more of a double entendre than we think. But and you have a subtitle, how the woke mob took my job, but gave me a voice. Um, Before that, were you the same way, or was this more of a defining moment for you?
Well, I mean, I have been outspoken on other issues in the past and challenged sort of whatever the narrative was. I was an elite gymnast as a child,
Oh, I
and
forgot. Yes, that's right.
yeah, and trained in a very cruel and abusive training environment. I was the 1986 national champion, so I made it, kind of all the way to the top. And I suffered as an adult, as I retired from the sport and went about my life. The abusive training practices continued to, cause me to doubt myself. I was depressed. I was anxious. I had an eating disorder. And ultimately, when I was 40, I wrote a book about the training culture. And it was really the first person account of the abusiveness and cruelty in the sport. And everybody knows now because of Larry Nassar being exposed, who was the doctor for Team USA Gymnastics and sexually abused over 500 athletes. But at the time when I said it, it was not popular. And I was called everything from a grifter to a liar and a bitter, angry ex gymnast and all this garbage, meant to silence me and meant to discredit me. The whole Olympic movement, that whole community came after me. And 10 years later, I was proven correct. The reason I spoke out is I wanted to make sense of it for myself. Why at 40 was I still suffering from that treatment? But two, I wanted it exposed because young girls continued to train in this environment and suffer. And USA Gymnastics was covering it up, local gyms were covering it up, and the US Olympic Committee was covering it up. So, I was no stranger to kind of speaking out against whatever the approved narrative was. Now, that was a much smaller kind of stage. And yet, still, we know from the Nassar case, the FBI was involved in covering it up, the International Olympic Committee, the USOC. So, some pretty big players there. I didn't know that at the time when I started, but I would say that kind of trained me and prepared me for the backlash I would face starting in 2020 on this much bigger issue.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You can make a lot of analogies between the sports. Having a son that was a professional baseball player, you can make tremendous analogies between that and life and sport.
Yeah.
A lot of lessons. It's sometimes tough to walk the fine line between being very, very tough as opposed to being abusive. Um, I was a karate guy, and I was afraid to be punched in the face. I didn't like that idea. But what the teacher did would be considered abusive, but I'm actually glad that he did it. He had four guys stand around me and punch and kick me simultaneously, so I had nowhere to run because I was getting hit from all sides. And he said to me, I love you. So I'm going to make sure that you don't get seriously hurt. You might get a little banged up, but not seriously hurt. But when you go out in the street, these people are going to want to kill you. And so I'm making you tough enough, because I grew up in a very high crime area, tough enough to defend yourself. So that's what I mean by a fine line.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think within the Olympic movement and the gymnastics community specifically, that's the point they've argued for a long time, that the line is blurry. I make the case that I think, at least in my sport, which I know the best, it's a pretty bright line. Sexual abuse clearly crosses that
Of
line.
course.
Forced starvation diets. We were, forced to
Yeah.
train 8 hours a day on 300 or 400 calories. Bullying. We were weighed in twice a day. Our weight was announced over the loudspeaker. We were berated publicly, constantly, every day. forced to train on very serious injuries. I trained on a broken ankle for 2 years. To me, these things are a bright line, and there's not a lot of question. And keep in mind, we were all minors. I was 12, 13, 14 years old. Didn't really have the kind of wherewithal to stand up for myself. Plus, it was completely normalized. So, at 14, when that's what you're surrounded by and everybody tells you that's the way it is, you think that's normal. And if you come to believe that if you suffer in that environment, it's your fault because you're weak, because of course that's what they tell you. So, I think in this instance, it's a pretty bright line, although I would agree with you. That sounds pretty rough, what you experienced.
Well, it made me pretty rough.
Yeah,
But where I grew up, that
you
was,
needed to be. Yeah,
if you weren't rough, you were going to get roughed up. So I'm not sorry for it. But obviously, what you're talking about is almost sadism and sexual abuse. Obviously, that's
yeah,
what my karate teacher had in mind.
right.
So
I think the physical and emotional abuse in the sport is so rampant, and it sort of beats the child down to the point that I think they're more vulnerable to the sexual abuse. It's very disorienting when you're physically and emotionally abused on a daily basis, and you come to think you deserve that treatment. So then, if a pedophile, and the national team coach in the 1980s was a pedophile, um, he's now been banned from the sport for raping several athletes. When they kind of enter your midst and you're all disoriented, you kind of accept the behavior, and it's all very confusing. So they're preying upon young children, and when anyone reported it, spoke of it, if you even dared to, you were the problem. And so adults here were protecting the reputation of the Olympic movement and the sport, and they were sacrificing children in the process, and that stuck with me, which is why when the schools closed, I felt so strongly that we as the adults need to speak up on behalf of children who were being sacrificed at the altar of these COVID fears, even though children were least at risk from any real harms of the virus, and most at risk from these ongoing restrictions.
it's an interesting paradox that you came from an environment where, in effect, you were kind of being coerced to conform
Yes,
at training, and yet, as an adult, you rebelled and
I
became
did.
nonconformist.
I did, and it's sort of one of the messages in the book, really, that like I started in a hole. I mean, I grew up in this environment of forced obedience. I was silent as a teenager. You did not push back, you did not speak up, you did not defend yourself. I was silent all of college. I didn't talk in class. I just, did my work and got my grades. And so if I can overcome that sort of lean towards conformity and obedience and stand up and do the right thing and say the hard thing, then I believe you can, not you, but I believe others can, because I really started out at a deficit.
So when the whole COVID cult sprung up, what was your first clue? And how did you begin to, in your mind, formulate an idea that there's something wrong here? Something's just not quite right. How did that happen?
Well, I was reading incessantly, and every article I read, there was some study, and I'd click every link and read the data and read all the, I mean, this is from the beginning, from as early as February, even before the lockdowns happened. And what was very clear from the beginning is that there was an age stratification to the risk. The median age of death in Italy, which was one of the first countries and cities, I think it was Milan, hit hard. We saw these catastrophic images on the television, but the median age of death was over 80. And so I knew from the outset that restricting children was the wrong thing to do. So, I kept my advocacy. I felt lockdowns more broadly were wrong, but I was trying to keep my job, and I kept my advocacy to those restrictions impeding children's lives for a variety of reasons. I thought we could find some common ground on children, but I knew from the very beginning, March 13th, 2020, I started screaming about it, which is when schools closed and lockdown started in San Francisco.
Yeah. And it's amazing how it happened almost virtually everywhere
At once.
and in a coordinated way, top down centralization with, they always talk about the local school boards
Yeah.
as if they have any control. And, I went to one board meeting in my life and I was the only guy there. And
Yeah.
all these women did was talk about whether it's better to have vanilla or chocolate cookies. That was the level of discussion.
Wow.
And when I brought up why I was there, which was their perverse sexual orientation teaching, they said to me, "Don't you care about your children?" So, in other words, my objecting to their curriculum means I don't care about my children.
Right. Oh yeah, we were called. It's interesting you mentioned that because obviously, well, it varied. Technically, who got to open a school district or not varies by state and district. But you're right. There's a National School Board Association, and they are sending clear instruction to all the local school boards, and they're all falling in line. But public health bureaucrats across the country gave cover to the school boards and gave cover to the teachers unions and gave cover to local governments, whether it was governors or mayors, to keep the schools closed. Everyone at this point says, I didn't do it. No one wants to own it at this point. They're saying it was, it's one of these. It was the governor. It was the school board. It wasn't me. It wasn't, Randy Weingarten. It wasn't Dr. Fauci. But all of the public health officials gave cover to everyone else. So I really hold them, and I place the blame squarely with them. Not many governors were strong enough to stand up to it. One or two.
One of the things I always say to people is, how in the world could you believe anything these people say, even if it's just the score of the Yankee game? If somebody lies to you,
they don't care.
And if you do business with somebody and they break every agreement they make with you, doesn't there come a time when you say to yourself, I'm not going to do business with this person anymore? And yet they continue to believe these creeps.
They would rather be in good standing with their tribe and with the group than be right. They do not want to stand apart. They feel virtuous in standing with the group, and they demonize anyone who dares to question or challenge. It doesn't matter what evidence is presented. I'm a conspiracy theorist. Meanwhile, I'm reading the actual data and the raw data that's all there and available for everyone. It conflicts with the headlines in the New York Times and the chyrons on CNN, but I'm the crazy one, vilified for doing my own research. Meanwhile, they're just believing whatever stupid headline was written in the New York Times, which essentially was a propagandistic talking point from the CDC. These journalists did not interrogate the issue. They did not look at the data. They were quick to attack parents or anyone, doctors even, who challenged the narrative. Careers were destroyed, but most importantly, we never really had a discussion on this because any dissenters were silenced and vilified. If we were able to have a discussion on this, we would have reached very different conclusions. In answer to your prior question, the other thing I did was I went back and I read the pre-pandemic playbook, which is an important document because it's written when there wasn't panic. And it clearly states that schools should never be closed for more than a handful of weeks, even with fatality rates far higher than what we see here with COVID. And yet, in districts like mine in San Francisco, schools were closed for 18 months. Playgrounds were closed for close to 10 months.
Yeah. Well, I could make the argument that for different reasons, it was a benefit, but not for the reasons that they give.
Fair enough. Your point is taken. I think for so many children, I'll use San Francisco as an example. 60% of the children in San Francisco public schools are low income, free and reduced lunch. These children were left home alone. Oftentimes their parents were hourly wage workers, essential Those of us deemed inessential were permitted to stay home with our children. They didn't have internet. They couldn't navigate the schooling. They weren't getting food. They were perhaps left home with their abusers. So I think for a lot of children, we may disagree, or you may disagree with the actual curriculum, but for a lot of children, school was the only safe space, and they were denied that for close to 2 years.
Well, my father was put in a reformatory for punching his teacher in the face after his teacher smashed him in the head just for talking to a girl in the class. And so my father got up and knocked him out.
Oh my goodness.
And I always joke with my dad, who's been dead since 1976. I used to say to him, Dad, you must have read the curriculum in advance.
Funny.
So to sum up, because we're going to start to run out of time, I assume your book can be purchased at Amazon. Have they tried to keep it out of the bookstores, or?
Absolutely. So it can be purchased at Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, or direct from the publisher at Levi'sUnbuttoned.com, which some folks prefer. It is Barnes and Noble will not make it available in their stores, which in and of itself is a form of shadow banning, to use a term of the day. And strangely, on the day my book actually went on sale, the day it launched on November 15th, it had been up for pre-sale for 2 weeks on Amazon. But strangely, on the day it was for sale, it was not available.
I call it Barnes and Nobles, but that's just no testicularity whatsoever. It's amazing. The people that work there, because I had a few books that I wrote, and the book had a provocative title. And when I would go and ask them for the book, and they would look at the title, they were appalled. And the book was just called America Doesn't Owe You a Living. And, it's not like it was a porno book or something.
No, that doesn't seem so bad.
But for them, of course, they think America does owe them a living. In fact, that's what most people think these days. So, what would be your closing message to parents out there that have succumbed to all this propaganda?
Well, I think the thing I'll tell you a brief story. So, the day after I quit very publicly, 3 members of the San Francisco Board of Education were recalled decisively. 75% of the voters that showed up recalled them for not opening schools. What that says to me is, whole lot of people agreed with me, but were too scared to actually stand up and say something. And really, the book is about encouraging people to stand up and say it. There's a lot of folks. I mean, it feels like we stand alone when we challenge the orthodoxy, but there's certainly some folks on the far other side who believe in it wholeheartedly. They're true believers. There were a lot of folks over the course of the 2-year period with the most restrictive policies in place that disagreed, but they were too afraid to stand up and use their voices and push back because they were afraid of the names they would be called. But if we'd all done it, we would have been a majority. And so that's my message. And what I would also just say is, even if you don't agree with me on this issue, they're going to come for you one day. So you've got to support other people who are willing to stand up and challenge. Do you support free speech or not? The only thing that protects free speech is more speech. And so I don't even care if you agree with me on this point or not. You really ought to be encouraging and supporting folks who are willing to challenge, even if you don't agree.
Yeah, a lot of right wingers that I know, they don't believe in free speech for leftists. Now,
right, it's all conditional on your view.
I am the ultimate antithesis to leftism. However, I would fight for the right of any leftist to speak. Because I understand the slippery slope, and I understand that I used to tell people, you're letting George Bush and his Patriot Act take away our liberty. And you think it's wonderful because it's George Bush. What happens when Hillary?
That's right.
What happens when she's in power?
That's right.
Allowed that power to go to her.
That's
and
right.
They just look at you with this dumb look on their face.
think what's most alarming to me, and I think it's true for the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, they actually seem all too willing to trade freedom for a feeling of safety and fitting in with the in crowd. And that, if that is the case, wow. But it sure feels like that in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Young people were largely silent and obedient and adherent to the rules. I'm trying to imagine a world in which when I was 19, I would have stayed home because the government told me I had to, or I might get, you know,
The
sick
ironic
for a day
part
or two.
is the people pushing these fascist policies are the people who in the 1960s at Berkeley and Mario Savio and the free speech movement was saying, question authority, don't trust anybody.
It's crazy. Neil Young is such a disappointment. I mean, where are the rebels?
It's called integrity. A person who has integrity is predictable and consistent. My wife
And
can tell you what I'll think of any subject without asking me.
yeah,
100% predictable because those principles don't change with
right.
the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really feel. I think a lot of my friends, you don't speak with anymore. They think, "What happened to Jen?" I haven't changed at all.
Right?
I have not changed in the slightest. What happened to you? Why were you silent in the face of this? You considered yourself an outspoken, courageous rebel. You think you're the resistance? You did nothing. You sent your kids to private schools while letting public school children suffer at home. You're the hypocrite, not me.
Yeah. Well, Jennifer, I commend you. You've done really a yeoman's job. And unfortunately, all I can say is may you be fruitful and multiply because we need a lot more of Jennifer Says in this world. Otherwise, we're heading down.